that. Now, one of the things that is sometimes levied against Muslims in modern discourse is that Muslims or Islam is not as good on the question of slavery as Christianity. I don't think this is true. But people who make this argument will say the Quran explicitly condones the enslaving of people. Muhammad himself owned slaves. There is no ban on slave owning or enslaving people anywhere in Islam. And those are some fairly serious charges. But do they make Islam superior to Christianity? It is, if you look closely at the New Testament, you can see that St. Paul and many other early Christians absolutely owned slaves. There's even some good evidence that Jesus may have been a slave owner. There is nowhere in the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, where it says that owning slaves is wrong. Jesus uses slavery as a metaphor, describing himself as the slave of God the Father. Stories about how good slaves should behave. There's really no difference in scripture on this as a moral question. Certainly, Islam is very clear on the basis of slavery. We see things like in the Surah An-Nisa that some guidelines for how Muslim men should behave towards women, prohibited to you of married women, except those your right hand possesses. And who are those your right hand possesses? The enslaved women. He goes on and regularly says that it is acceptable for Muslim men to have sexual relations with their female slaves. That is pretty straight up and clear. This idea is set up very early in Islamic law. And of course, our first thought is, this is terrible. These women are going to be horrendously abused. Now, the interesting thing about this is, from an enslaved woman's point of view, having sex with her owner might not be a terrible idea. From a very calculating point of view. Because under Islamic law, if she becomes pregnant with her master's child, she cannot be sold. If she gives birth, she gains a special legal status called the al-Walad, the mother of the baby, literally. We could just translate al-Walad as baby mama if we wanted. Now, once a woman has attained the status of al-Walad, she can never be sold under any circumstances. When her master dies, if she has not already been freed, she becomes free. She receives a portion of his estate, and he must support her throughout the rest of her life. Her children, by her owner, will have full status going to their father. So they are not of any lesser status to the children he would have with a free woman that he had married. This has some really interesting effects. From the time of Harun al-Rashid down to the middle of the 19th century, almost every Islamic ruler comes to power because his father was a ruler, is the child of an enslaved woman. Um, this becomes a very, very normal practice, largely because Muslim men are only allowed to marry 4 times, but they can own almost an infinite number of slave women. And for many Muslim royal families, they will not marry ever. Uh, so they will only have enslaved women as concubines. One of the results, because it becomes established fairly early that Muslim people cannot be enslaved legally, that enslaved women are coming from areas outside of the Muslim world. They are often quite different looking from the majority of the Arab ruling class. Whether they are being imported from Northern Europe to Islamic Spain, or from Eastern Europe to the Ottoman Empire, or from East Africa to some of the kingdoms in Arabia. And if, after multiple generations, the mothers of the rulers are always coming from the enslaved populations, some of these sons will begin looking like their mother's people. And we have stories, for instance, of an Arab ruler of Spain whose mother, his grandmother, and his great grandmother were all enslaved women from Northern Europe. So he had white blonde or platinum blonde hair and very pale skin. He did not want to look like a enslaved person when he went to address the other Muslims and Arabs in southern Spain. So he dyed his hair and he wore makeup to darken his skin. You have other examples like this from other places, and it gives a very interesting idea of what happens. It's also not just the rulers that this is going on with, but rich men in general. We even have a couple of very interesting literary examples. A physician in Iraq around the year 1000 named Ibn Butlan gives a guide to prospective buyers of all of the different types of women available in slave markets in Iraq in his time, and gives a guide to how different women from different areas have different attributes. So depending on what you are seeking in an enslaved woman, whether someone who has a good voice for singing, or is a good cook, or is very pleasing in the bed, you might want to look for these particular nationalities, which is interesting. We even have a guide from Iraq in the same time period on how to successfully become a pimp by purchasing women in the slave markets. Because the slave markets of Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries are massive. Now, it's not just women who are coming into these markets. There are also, again, coming from beyond the Islamic territories, eunuchs. What are eunuchs? Eunuchs are males who, before they reach puberty, have had an operation done on them, removing their genitalia completely and leaving them prepubescent throughout their lives. Now, eunuchs were pretty much unknown in Arabia before the time of Islam, but they were found in the wealthiest households in the lands the Muslims conquered in both Persian and Roman empires. having captured castrated men in war, the new Muslim conquerors wondered what to do with them, and one of the most obvious ways was to use them as harem guards, because these are men who weren't really men, who could be deployed to protect and defend women who were not to be seen by anyone other than their owners, their husbands, their fathers, and could serve and defend. Now, eunuchs are always going to be imported from non-Muslim areas. Early, it seems like the majority come from Eastern Slavic Europe. There is pretty good evidence that the Vikings made an enormous amount of money selling castrated young men to Muslims in Spain and in Iran. There's also a large trade in castrated Turks into the central Middle East. But over time, those areas no longer become available, and the majority of eunuchs in later centuries will come from southern Sudan and the area around there in East Central Africa. Here in this picture, it's from a photograph taken in 1929. The women are from the harem of the last caliph. The men are their eunuch guards. Even though the caliphate has ended, these men have really no other possible occupation. Even though slavery had been illegal for more than half a century by this point, they really could not go home. Now, to get an idea of the slave trade that is bringing eunuchs and women from all parts of the world, as well as workers, it's useful to think of kind of the vast volume of people. Now, it's been calculated that in Muslim lands, the average length of time a person spent in slavery is about 7 years. Most people who were enslaved would be freed. Once they were freed, they became ordinary poor Muslims. So in some ways, it continues to use sort of the Roman model of slavery. It is not generational. Now, because there's such a rapid turnover, there is an enormous demand. And the slave trade centered on Baghdad is one of the forces that will drive trade out from the center, will bring in the Vikings in Northern Europe. It will develop a trade by European merchants selling other merchants from cities like Venice and Amalfi. It will lead Muslim raiders to go south of the Sahara to the lands of the Sahel and spread Islam in that direction. It will create an enormous sea trade going to East Africa. And in East Africa, they will arrive in what they call the land of the Zanj. The Zanj is a name used in medieval Arabic sources to describe the entire eastern coast of Africa from Somalia in the north down to Mozambique. It is probably the same name as Azania the Romans had called part of this coast. We know that a slave trade had begun from East Africa by sea to southern Iraq and Iran under the Sassanid Persian Empire. It becomes bigger. And unlike the trade, while there are women and eunuchs brought in this trade, one of the major forces here is a trade looking for workers to be brought back to southern Iraq. Southern Iraq in the early Islamic period is one of the most intensively developed economic areas in the world. It is an area of a rapidly growing economy, and there is lots of work that the free peasants of southern Iraq have no interest in doing. Digging canals, clearing wasteland to create more farmland, growing sugarcane, things like this. Slaves brought from East Africa will work in large gangs here in southern Iraq. It is really the only area in the Muslim world where you see anything like plantation slavery. And because you have these large groups of enslaved men working together, slave revolts happen regularly in southern Iraq. The first one we know of as early as 696. The largest, though, is one that begins outside Basra in about 869 and will last for 14 years. This is the second most successful slave revolt in world history. It is led by a man with the rather significant name of Ali ibn Muhammad. And Ali ibn Muhammad claims that he is a descendant of Ali, which would appeal to Shia. But he preaches that anyone, no matter what their background is, can be and should be the ruler of the Muslim community based on their own merits, which is a fairly appealing thing if, like Ali ibn Muhammad, you are looking to find people to support a rebellion. Ali goes around to areas in southern Iraq seeking out Zanj, who are easily identifiable because they are Black Africans. And he talks to them and tells them that God has sent him to liberate them and free them from bondage. Well, of course, many people don't listen to him, but eventually he gets enough followers that he's able to begin a rebellion. It is a rebellion that will last for a very long time. It will be arguably the reason that the Abbasid Caliphate will ultimately start to decline and fall. He and the rebels will eventually control most of southern Iraq. Now, while most of the rebels are former slaves, they are not anti-slavery. And in fact, they enslave the former rulers and slave owners. The caliphate will fight back and will develop some very interesting military forces to crush the slave rebellion. It is put down. Large-scale plantation slavery largely disappears from southern Iraq. However, if one goes to southern Iraq, one can meet large numbers of people, still a minority, like the men in this picture, who claim descent from the rebels of the Zanj. Now, the army that puts them down is also interesting. A few decades earlier, there is a prince, Al-Mutasim, who is the son of the caliph, the brother of the caliph. Eventually, he will be caliph. But while he is simply the brother of the ruler, he decides he'd like to have more power. He has money, but he doesn't have much backing. And he takes his money and goes into the slave markets of Baghdad and begins buying men, mostly men of Turkish ethnicity, and training them to be soldiers. Now, they are originally just his private bodyguard. But when rebellions happen under his brother, his soldiers fight and are more successful than Arab or Persian soldiers. When he becomes caliph, he increases the number of enslaved soldiers under his command because he finds that slave soldiers, or at least he believes, are loyal only to each other and to their owner. They are not worried about tribal identities, local loyalties, Shia Sunni politics, things like that. They don't care. They are purely professional soldiers. Their job is to kill and to win battles. This makes them better from the perspective of the government. The government, instead of relying on local officials and communities to produce armies of soldiers who might have their own interests, can just give money, which the government can use to buy soldiers who don't care and will do what the government wants. It works well. Soon, these slave soldiers, called usually Mamluks or Ghalams, are mostly drawn from Turkish nomadic tribes from southern Russia and Central Asia. In some ways, they're different from other slaves. Unlike most other slaves throughout history, they regularly get to keep their own names once they're in slavery. They are paid once they achieve higher ranks. They usually enter slavery at the age of 10 to 12, and then will move up the ranks as they get older. For the next 1,000 years, slave soldiers will be common in most Islamic states. It allows the ruler to be more powerful. It separates the military from civil society and creates sort of a disjunction between rulers and rule, which matters a lot. Now, some interesting things happen in slave armies because they, of course, have the military power in the societies in which they live. In theory, of course, they are loyal to their owner. But what if their owner isn't loyal to them? Things can get interesting. In the 13th century, huge numbers of slaves from the Black Sea are brought to Egypt to create a Mamluk army. In 1249, the French, this is during the Crusades, will invade Egypt. Mamluk soldiers defeat the French, capture the King of France at the Battle of Al-Mansura. So they're very, very successful. The ruler, Turan Shah of Egypt, however, goes against them. The Mamluks overthrow him and place their leader, a man named Aybak, as Sultan of Egypt. Egypt will be under control of the Mamluk Corps from 1249 until 1798. Mamluk Egypt will be the last great Egyptian empire. You can see it there in red. They will be a great military power. They will be the group that first defeats the Mongols. Other Mamluk states will be created in India, in Iraq, in various other times and places throughout Islamic history. There is something, though, that's very odd about them. Now, they're slaves. They are in charge. When the army of the enslaved seizes power in Egypt, there's something they do not do, and that is they do not free themselves. They no longer have an owner. Their commander, their general, is now the ruler of Egypt. So in theory, he owns the whole army. But instead of going home, leaving, just becoming free men, they continue for more than 500 years to remain as slaves, to purchase new generations of young men from overseas, bring them to Egypt, train them as soldiers, rise them up through the ranks, and once you have been a successful Mamluk, you can retire, gain your freedom, become wealthy, and set up your sons not as soldiers, not as part of the government, but as wealthy merchants or other things. It's a very, very odd system. It is Mamluks, by the way, who crushed the Zanj revolt. Now, as I mentioned, the Zanj will be a major blow against the Abbasids. And next, let us talk about how the Abbasids